Thank you everyone for joining us for our deep dive into doc filmmaking with Duy Linh Tu. And I would just love to, if you could start just kind of giving us, your background a little bit, and yeah, even just where you're at right now in this great classroom.
So this is my fake background. This is our normal background at the J School where I teach, Columbia J School. That's obnoxious of me to just say J School and assume you guys assume it's Columbia, but Columbia J School. So I've been a professor there since 2000. No, 2001, because that was the 9/11 year. So 9/11 was the first year, and so it's good. This is my 20th year there in some capacity. So I actually started off as an online kind of web geek. I worked at, actually, no, let me take a step back. I graduated from Columbia Journalism where I went, and then I went into broadcast television, because back then the school had 3 tracks. It was, it was you were a newspaper concentrator, a magazine concentrator, or broadcast. And broadcast just threw everything all together, whether it was television or radio. Just if you weren't written words, you were that. And so I was that. And so I went to work for ABC News in London right after graduating J School, and it was cool. Not the ABC News part, the in London part was super cool. I got to live overseas and to report over there. But the sad reality is back, this was pre 9/11 again. And so back then we had very little interest in international news. So basically London was the hub for Europe, Africa, Asia. So you get stories and you would filter to London, and London would pitch to New York, and New York would decide. And invariably it would be all United States focused stories. Obviously that's changed since 9/11. So my stay in London stopped, and I came back to the States, and I did not want to work at ABC headquarters, because if you've ever worked at a broadcast unit, headquarters is swimming with sharks. It's like the worst place to be. I mean, it's great if you're of that mindset, if you're really ambitious and will just kill anyone to get to the top. It's great. But if you're not like that, then it's probably not your cup of tea, and it was not my cup of tea. And coincidentally, so that was 1999, and coincidentally, that was the birth of .com 1.0. And so I joined a .com that made videos. And this was back when people were doing dial-up. And remember back then you have like the little square screens of video, and it would look like a watercolor painting, because it was just like, it was just all mushy. That was the type of videos. But it was cool because I was getting paid to make videos that didn't look like broadcast television. So that was super, super cool. And then I worked at the .com. So the .com was great, learned a lot. I was like employee 17, and a month later there were 300 employees. So it was like it was one of those big crash and burn type of stories. And so we did that. And then I left to form my own production company. And at the same time, the dean of the journalism school, who was my professor when I was there, said, "Hey, don't you do that internet thing?" And it was like, that's what he called it, the internet thing. I was like, I guess I do that internet thing. And he goes, "We should teach some internet things here." And so he asked me to come on as an adjunct, and then I just kind of stuck around and became a full-time professor in 2008, I believe. So I adjuncted for like 8 years, because I was still producing my own stuff and running my own production company. And I kind of still am. I just have a full-time title and still produce, and that's where I am. So nothing has majorly changed in the last decade and a half or whatever. We're doing the same stuff. Obviously the media landscape has changed, but actually the stuff I do has not. So that's my brief resume.
Yeah, no, totally. Well, can you tell me, I mean, I know I saw some of the classes that you've been teaching recently, especially when focused on like science and climate change, which was really interesting, but can you tell me how you kind of honed down like being a documentary professor too in the journalism school? Like was that always a part of your, I mean, I know you came in during the internet era, but when did you start becoming really targeting that
so when I started at J School, I was like I did video. I always did video. I was always self-taught. Like I actually had like done the broadcast program, like I told you, but you don't become an expert shooter or editor or anything like that while you're taking that course. And when you go to work at a network, you don't even get to touch the gear. Like I didn't touch any of the gear. So I wanted to really touch the gear and do the thing. And so when I came back, I started, at that .com, and I started producing, terrible stuff, but I produced a lot of it. And so, each one gets hopefully a little less terrible. But when I went to Columbia, the internet thing was whatever we made of it. Like, so we were doing HTML classes and Flash classes and all that kind of stuff back then. And so it was just making stuff that worked on the internet, not necessarily video. And over the years, I was kind of like, I'm over this. Also, tools were being invented so that if you wanted to publish a website, you could use Blogger. Remember Blogger way back when, or whatever those pages. So there were tools where you didn't have to know the mechanics of how to build a web page or do an animation or create a slideshow. Tools just were developed, and so that was kind of an irrelevant thing to teach at that point. And so it was back to what it should have always been, the content. And so video, like it's pretty hard to like unmarry the story from the production, right? Yeah. Whereas like with HTML, you can have the frame of the page, but the story's in it or something else. And so when I went to Columbia, it was like, it took a while for me to get out of that they called it new media back then, new media ghetto, where we were just the nerds on, in the corner. And so over time, video became more important, not just broadcast video, but internet video. And I just happened to be right place, right time, because I was already doing it. Like, no one cared about it while I was doing it. And then you just kind of do it. And then one day someone cares. It's like being in a punk band in a scene somewhere and no one cares about the scene. And suddenly, oh, Seattle's big, right? It must have felt like, when those things, like you're just doing your thing, or, house music, like there's an underground scene and then somebody suddenly says you're important. That felt very much like digital video at the time. Like, we've been doing it forever. And then they're like, oh, I guess you're quality enough to play with us. And so that's what happened.
Can you tell me, I'm going to start with kind of intro to doc film and then jump into more, the deeper logistical aspects of it. But I'm curious, and I know I experienced this as somebody that learned a lot from you in your class, but some of the fundamental things that you always introduce to students or filmmakers wanting to be and go down the doc filmmaking route, what are some fundamental, would you say, groundwork that people need to have going into this field?
Well, there's a few there. Well, if you think about documentary film, there's like three kind of pillars that you always have to worry about. First is just craft, right? Like technical skills. Like you have to be able to shoot, or know someone who has to be able to shoot on your team. And if you're starting out, typically you're doing a lot of it yourself, or edit, right? So there's craft, or you the button pushing, you actually have to know, right? Secondly is the story and reporting, and this is in no order of importance, just story and reporting. Like, what's the story you want to tell, and how do you report it? And third is distribution, and which is actually at Columbia, we're very bad at teaching that. We're kind of good at the reporting and storytelling. I really put an emphasis on the craft of it, but sometimes we run out of time. But we barely talk about the distribution. And so you can be a filmmaker, but to be a professional filmmaker is a wholly other thing, right? Also, to go beyond professional filmmaker to career filmmaker is even tougher. So my theory, I always say, any idiot can make one film. The second film's the trick, and that's the hardest thing. So you have to know craft, especially when you're starting out. You're not going to have big budgets. So luckily, gear is so cheap these days, and you can, not that it's ideal, but you could film everything on an iPhone and get the aesthetics, or $800 DSLR with a $400 microphone. So gear-wise, that's one thing you can immediately get into. And also with the internet, like YouTube, there's so many resources out there that are free to learn the craft, right? Which is different than storytelling, the actual physical craft of that, and which I didn't have. So when we were making all our videos back then, there was no like YouTube to go, hey, how do you use this camera, or how do I film better, or what's composition? But now there's all that online, so that's great. And so the second part is like, living in New York, I guess it's kind of like living in LA. The joke is like everyone in LA has a screenplay, right? Everyone in New York has a doc, right? And that's like that's the thing about it. And I think that a lot of it is many people don't actually don't want to make films. They want to be a filmmaker. And the distinction is, I remember when, maybe this will resonate with some of the people out here. When I was young, like we would sit in high school, like writing down band names. Like we would just like write band names. This would be a cool band name, right? We never wanted to practice. we might have instruments. We never wanted to record or write songs. We just wanted to be in a band, right? And so I think a lot of times when people say I wanted to be a documentary filmmaker, there's a sexiness to it, and so they're like, okay, I'll say I'm a documentary filmmaker, and because you're not like a daily news reporter,
Right.
like you don't have to. You can just say you're working on something, right? Like where if you say I'm a daily news reporter, people could say, oh, I read you yesterday, right?
Exactly.
So it's right. So if you're not a daily news report documentarian, that buys you a lot of time, but also it allows you to just dick around a lot, right? So secondly is you have to really understand, do I want to do the storytelling and the reporting, which is different than like hanging out with cool people and saying I'm a filmmaker,
Right.
right? Which is wildly different. And I don't disparage anyone who does that. We all do some version of that in our lives. But I find like a lot of people that never complete a project are either perfectionists or they fall into that category that, it's not meaningful enough for me to finish it.
Right.
Yeah, and so that's the third. And then the third thing is really understanding the business of it, which took me forever to learn, like how to be a professional filmmaker. First of all, you have to feed yourself, right? That's something you don't think about. Like I remember some of my early budgets, like I would put together budgets for film. I'd be like, oh, I need like $2,000 to fly here, and then
Yeah.
I need like $1,000 for that camera or whatever. I would make this, and I never put a line item for myself. Like,
Oh,
okay, you're gonna make this film, but how are you gonna pay rent and eat?
yeah.
Right? Everyone else is getting paid but you. So it takes you a long time to understand the business side of this, especially when you come from a journalism background. Business sounds dirty.
Hmm.
Like pure filmmakers and pure documentary filmmakers have always had to deal with fundraising. But if you're a journalist and you work like at a traditional newspaper, you never dealt with the business side, and it was actually taught to you that the business side is the dirty side, right?
It's like the evil side.
Yeah, the evil that allows you to keep lights on. And so
Right.
but the third kind of pillar of filmmaking is understanding the business side. A, how to raise the money, but also B, once you've raised that money and someone trusted you, like a foundation or a funder or somebody, they want your work out there. And so that's the third part. Is like, how do I work the festival system? How do I get a distributor? How do I make a deal where I can get like this seen by as many people as possible? Because you can be a filmmaker and never get distributed. Like you could just love the art and craft of it, and
Right.
kudos to you, right? But that's wildly different than following that third part, which is getting your work seen, which I think is actually very important, right? Because your stories should be important enough for the world to see them.
I really like how you broke it down into three pillars, and I want to circle back eventually to that business side, because I think that's, like you said, not something that's probably discussed enough. And I think we have a lot of enthusiastic people in our community that do ask that question a lot, which is great. So it'll be great to get to that. But I do remember specifically, you do focus a lot on honing your craft and like making sure you have a story itself. I mean, can you tell me a little bit about why that is one of the major things you teach, is like, what is the story? And you ask that question so much, but why is that so important to know it so well before you go into it?
Well, I mean, a couple things, right? So I've been teaching journalism for 20 years. I've been a journalist a little bit more than that, and so I think it's the hardest skill to learn when, and I use journalist, filmmaker interchangeably, right? The storyteller, whatever you want to say, right? We start off interested in something because we're interested in it, right? Whether it's immigration or environmental issues, climate change, the guy down the street, right, is an interesting guy, or the bar. Like we're interested in things, which is a great starting point, right? But the trick is to make it interesting to other people. And so, because if you don't make it interesting to other people, like no one but you cares, and that's fine, right? It's fine. Like that's the difference between like making a meal for yourself and opening a restaurant, right? Like you have to make sure that your restaurant will appeal to a lot of people. And sometimes when I bring this up, people get cynical, they think I'm cynical, but no, it's a part of the third pillar, which is the business side, right? And also, and to figure out if something has meaning to someone, you have to have a good story, right? And so the story is, people often misuse the term story all the time, and us journalists do it all the time. We say like that news story, like, did you read that news story, right? Whereas most people don't. When they think story, they think fairy tale, right? So a journalist was like, what's the news story? Oh, the news story is Trump announced this yesterday. to most readers, most of the public, that's news. That's a fact that happened, right?
Right.
When we think of story, we think Once Upon a Time,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in the land of La 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 or Star Wars or whatever, right? And so knowing the story is a couple things. Having something important to say, like, immigration policy is bad, but also telling it in a way that people want to watch to the end, right? And so those are two things. I think journalists are really good at the first one, which is today, this policy is going to screw over this number of people, right? Or
Right.
this policy is going to raise our pollution by X number of percent. We're really good at that. And for most concerned citizens, that's important news to know. And if they weren't dealing with like rent or feeding their children or getting to work on time, they would probably pay more attention to it, right? Our default is we want to be entertained. And I think filmmakers are really good at entertaining, not so good at the reporting stuff, right? So a good journalistic documentary filmmaker combines the two. And so that's why it's important, like, I have something important to say. It's meaningful to the public. Like, if you vote for this politician, he's going to give you policy that affects you this way, right? Or if you continue to buy this, the world will turn out to be like that, right? Or if you ignore this phenomenon. So those are important things to know. But just because they're important doesn't mean someone will watch it, right? And so that's the other part is like, how do I put it in a way where people are dying to watch it? I'll give you an example, like Lion King on Netflix, right? I don't know if anyone's watched that. I mean, it was a hit. I only got through 3 episodes.
You mean Tiger King?
Yeah, sorry, Tiger King, not the Disney one, Tiger King, right? If anyone's, I can't see your faces, you're all dark, but I'm assuming some of you have watched it.
Sure.
Like that's like a trash story. Like there is no import to anyone's lives, right? Like that doesn't have any effect in my life if whether I watch Tiger King or not. Yeah, but it's super entertaining, right? Yeah, and we could debate the reasons why it's entertaining. It's a little bit pornographic. It's a little bit kind of
exploitative.
Exploitative, right? It's a little bit classist, right? So we love all that shit, right? And so, but also at the same time, it'd be nice to have something with meaning, such as, like I said, inequity in America, right? Like, can we have a story about inequity that makes people want to watch 8 episodes in a row, right? So that's the thing that is really important about knowing your story, knowing what's important and how it will affect the people around you, but also getting them to want to watch it, right? Journalists are really good at the first part. We're dang good at the first part. We're terrible at the second part. That's why Netflix buys Tiger King and won't buy an 8-part series on climate change, frankly, right? And so if we marry the two, we're going somewhere. And that's why, back to your question, why it's so important to know the story. So story has 2 parts. Story is the important part to the people, and story is the entertaining part to people.
How do you, I see this a lot, both across the board with some of our, I mean, even me personally, like being a journalist, and then also just in a lot of beginning filmmakers as well, whether it's youth or adult, getting stuck in that topic loop. And you touched this a little bit, where we have a ton of topics we want to film about or do documentaries about, but then we have nothing to say in a more minuscule way, right? Like, I want to write about, or I want to do a film about climate change, for example, or I want to do a film about homelessness, like these great topics. But then when it comes to actually finding and creating that story, it's like you hit a very fast wall.
Right. So let's take climate change, for example, right? Remember last year, the UN wrote that report that we're all going to die in 40 years or something like that. You remember,
Right.
like, it was like the world was going to burn in 40 years. And like my Facebook page lit up for about half a day about how terrible it was. And then it went away, right? No one talks about that UN report anymore, right? I mean, even before pandemic, like no one talked about it. And there's a reason for that. It's like, it was presented in a way that was important. So that a brief moment that we as humans were like, wow, we should really pay attention to this because it's dangerous. But it didn't have that hook, right? That had that hook of story, right? And to your point, like, how do we get someone to go from thinking, ooh, climate change is bad, mm-hmm. to I'm so engrossed in this narrative that I'm going to learn something beyond climate change is bad.
Right.
Maybe I'm
line narrative.
Exactly. How do we learn something how do we present something like, okay, we know it's bad, but what can you do? What is the call to action for you to do this, right? And that exchange of information takes time, like physical time on a timeline. Like it takes hours of a film, right? And so how do you buy hours of a film? Meaning the attention of someone for hours. You buy that by making it interesting and having a narrative arc in it, right? Making us want to watch a character. You know, I teach this in my documentary class. All great stories have already been written, right? The structure of this, and I'll play a game with you guys right now if you guys want to participate, that I do with all my students, right? Finish this sentence for me, right? Once upon a time, there was a knight, and the knight was trying to save the princess. But what got in the knight's way?
Anybody want to chat it?
Anyone? Shout it out.
Great, or unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Let's give
Anyone?
Let's give him like
the dragon.
Who said the dragon?
This is Erin. Hey guys.
Erin, how are you? Did anyone else think the dragon?
No, somebody else said tornado in the chat.
Okay, the tornado, right? Okay, the tornadoes. Okay, I'll take the tornado. But a few of you said the dragon, right? Or sometimes it's the wicked witch. You might answer, right?
Right.
So why do I bring this up? I bring this up is because we've been learning. TBT said dragon was the first thing they thought, right? So teaching at Columbia, I have a very international student base, and I ask this question of them all the time. And regardless of what country they're from, they say the dragon, right? And the reason I bring that up is that humans know narrative form very well. There's an expectation. The hero, the goal, which is the princess, right? And the thing that gets in the way, which is the dragon, right? And so when we talk about documentary filmmaking, and I love my journalism counterparts, we think about the importance. We think about climate change is bad, right? We think about X% of blah, blah, blah in the air causes blah, 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 and blah, and blah, and blah, and blah, and Republicans this and Democrats that, blah, 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 blah. No one gives a shit. At the end of the day, no one gives a shit about that. If you believe climate change is bad, you're gonna be like, climate change is bad.
Right.
Like if you don't think it's a problem, you're never gonna think it's a problem, right? And so basically, the only way you actually change thought or give true believers actual facts to kind of continue the conversation is by giving them more facts, and that takes time, right? And so I bring up the dragon thing, is that narrative, that's the thing that gets you to the end. That's the thing that gets you to the end. And most times journalists want to just say, the knight saved the princess. Right? If I just said the knight saved the princess, many of you maybe have children, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, or whatever, you've read stories to them, right? Imagine if you read the last page first. There's no story, right? There's no story there. You know, and if you read a newspaper article, for example, like the knight story, it would read something like, today, a knight saved the princess from the dragon. I was very happy to be saved, said the princess, right? You would read a news story that reads like that, right? Very informational, very factual, right? It got the point out there, but I don't want to go deeper into the story, nor do I need to, right? With filmmaking, we have to go back to our roots of understanding narrative. We have to present a story, regardless of topic, right? Whether it's climate change, immigration, homelessness, in a way that gets someone to the end of 90 minutes, right? And the way that you do that is presenting a narrative, which is hero, goal, villain. And there's I didn't invent that. Shakespeare didn't invent that. You know, the cavemen invented that, right? If you look at old cave drawings, there's like a dude, and then there's like the woolly mammoth, and then there's the saber-toothed tiger, right? Even back then, like cave drawings, people understood narrative, right? That tension. And so we have to really understand story from the narrative perspective. What can capture the attention of my viewer in a way that will make them want to learn more facts? Because each minute that we have on camera is another opportunity to throw a fact at someone, right?
Yeah.
So that's the key thing there. Really understanding narrative form, easier said than done. And how do I translate that to any topic that I want to go to?
I'm curious, and you kind of mentioned it briefly when we were going through this. How important do you see that maybe not all, but most documentary films have that call to action at some point? that leave viewers and people that have stayed through that 90 minutes with something to follow up with?
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't think every film needs to have a call to action, and some of them feel really heavy-handed. You know, like I thought a great film was Food Inc. It's about, you know, processed food and all that, and it was a little long, but there's a good information on it. And I think they presented the case that we've created a supply chain system in the United States that just is inherently terrible for the environment, for people, in terms of food. Right? It presented an amazing case, and at the end, suddenly, as the credits were playing, there was like this Bruce Springsteen song came on, and then all these words started flashing on the screen about how I should do this and that and that. I already knew I should have, right? So sometimes, like, the messaging, the call to action isn't as specific. It's in basically how you want, what information you want to give to your viewer so that they can act on their own, right? I personally don't like things like call your senator at the end, right? It's like, well, there's 400 trillion ways of reacting to this, right? And it becomes suddenly this political statement that you're making, right? I like things like, here's a hotline, 800, like those things like that. But the call to action should be internal to the film. It's like, this person's behavior in the film resulted in this. Maybe your behavior shouldn't be like that. Or maybe you should avoid that behavior. Or maybe that behavior is great and do more of that, right? So I think that call to action should be a part of that narrative, right? Because we like heroes. Like if we watch a fiction film, you either identify or you don't identify with the hero, right? But if you do identify with the hero, even if they're a bad person, right? The reason you identify with them is you can reflect in your own actions what they're doing, right? And so I think documentary, the best ones, you can do the same thing. You're like, okay, this behavior is leading to this. Let me reflect on if I'm a part of that.
I kind of want to switch just for at least a couple of minutes to the more technical shooting side of things. What are some, maybe mistakes isn't the right word, but what are some things that you think every single person starting off in doc film needs to know about either their equipment or audio, or just something to be like, listen, you just need to have these basics down, even if you're starting off?
Right. A couple things. Well, you know that self-help guru, Tony Robbins?
Yes.
Right. Do you guys know that? I don't know if you're down with him. I'm not particularly, but I read the foreword to one of his books one day because I was like, what is this guy all about, right? And there was a Netflix documentary about him, and I didn't want to watch it, so I read the foreword to one of the books because it's like free on Amazon. You can read the
foreword part. Yeah.
Yeah, whatever, right? You can read that part. And he actually had a great line. He said, "You'll never be satisfied with what you can do in a year, but you'll be amazed what you can do in 10." And I was like, oh, wow, that kind of makes sense. And that's been my whole life, right? Like in a year, I've always wanted to move faster than I had, right? But when I reflect, now I'm old enough to be able to say this, once I reflect on 5 or 10 years, I was like, oh man, I came a far way, right? And I say that in terms of production because you can't get good at all of it at once. So that's the first message, right? Like you can't be the best cinematographer all at once. You can't be the best editor all at once. You can't be the best sound recordist all at once. You can't. You simply can't. So advice number one is like, pick one that you really want to get good at while improving the others, right? Like if you like images, shoot. If you love editing, work with friends and get their footage and edit their footage, right? So that's one, like where you really want to take time to refine one skill before you move on. That said, if you had to pick one, you mentioned audio. Audio is important. So the mind is able to process bad video. It's not able to process bad audio. And what I mean, like, you know, when I use this example a lot, have you ever driven in a car and you're listening to a song and you're driving over state lines, or you're driving past where the radio tower can reach and the song starts crackling? You know that moment, right?
Yes.
Even if it's your favorite song, I bet you have about 15 seconds worth of time before you change the station, right?
If that, yeah.
If that, right? Like if you really love the song, you might hold out for the chorus or something like that, right? But your head can't process this. We are something in our head here, our brain can't process bad audio. So we will notice bad audio. Whereas bad footage, our brain can fill in the gaps. Like, you know, if you ever watch footage from a war zone and people are running around and things are shaky,
Right.
Even in fiction films like 1917, that film that just won the Oscar
Right,
or
where
whatever,
they do it
right?
purposely. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, it's like shaky and stuff like that. We can fill in the blanks, right? We can totally fill in the blanks there. We can't fill in the blanks with bad audio. So I would learn good audio, and good audio is not just about equipment. Oh, that's another thing. It's kind of related. I'm going to jump around a little bit.
No,
You
please.
always think that you have to have the best equipment. The beautiful thing about 2020, you can have a dirt cheap set of gear and make a Hollywood film, because the technology has gotten so great at this point where if you buy something like $100 microphone versus a $3,000 microphone, it's not 30 times better, right? It's not a 30 times better piece of equipment, right? Like if your budget's 100, get the 100. So the mistake is thinking that we have to have the right gear. Now you have to learn the right technique. So if you're learning audio, you learn mic placement. It's less about the mic, it's about the mic placement. Where should I place this mic so it sounds good, right? So things like that are more important than getting hooked up in gear. So audio would be one. And secondly, I would learn how to, I guess it's not a technical skill, learn repetition. So if I want to get better at shooting, everyone has a phone in their pocket, right? We're not all loaded, and might not have even like a $400 DSLR, but we all have a phone, right? I would practice shooting sequences. And what do I mean by a sequence is that when you're putting together a film, there's kind of like an essay, right? Like an essay is built on paragraphs, and paragraphs are built on sentences, right? And sentences are built on words, and words are built on letters, right? So if you use that kind of paradigm for visuals, the letter is like the shot. I'm gonna take my phone. I'm gonna take there. Can you see it somewhere there? Somewhere right there's my phone, right? So I'm gonna take a shot, but a series of shots forms a sequence, right? And so you want to start learning about sequences, because we want to build our vocabulary. Sequences are words, okay? So what do I mean by a sequence? A sequence is someone doing something, and I'm getting enough material to illustrate that something. So maybe it's someone, making a salad, right? Someone's making a salad right here. What would be the elements of that sequence?
Is anyone going to unmute anyone?
Anyone?
We gotta get the supplies.
Get the supplies, right? And so even Lauren, thank you for answering, even within getting the supplies, you have to even be more granular, right? Because getting the supplies is too vague of a term. The first thing I have to get is hand on handle of refrigerator, hand pulling handle, right? Hand reaching into refrigerator to grab cucumbers. Wide shot of me behind the refrigerator, so you know that I'm in front of a refrigerator, close up of my hand on that cucumber. Does that make sense, right? So something as silly and little like that, it is kind of very much like someone learning a language. Like if you've ever studied a foreign language and you're learning Spanish and you're learning the first few words, that's the same kind of idea, where I'm training myself to recognize words. I'm training myself to recognize patterns, and sequences are patterns of actions, right? And so in the visual world, these patterns are wide shots and close-ups, right? Wide shots and close-ups. So unfortunately, most of us live in the middle shot world, right? And that's kind of the shot we all take, because when we lift up our iPhones, it defaults to the middle shot. So what you're gonna wanna practice is shooting wide shots and then getting ultra close for the details, right? And so that's the second thing I would, this is not a filmmaking session specifically, but just do things like film a sequence. If you have a partner and they're making a salad, shoot the sequence there, right? Or if you have a child and the child's playing with Legos, shoot the child playing with Legos, right? And so you have to build this kind of muscle memory if you really want to be a filmmaker, of being able to recognize the words, the visual words, to be able to have that in our pocket so that we can start telling the story, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right, so.
What would you say for, because we have a really great mix of experience levels in this chat right now, what would you say for, if somebody is working either you know, as a hobby doing filmmaking in addition to their job, or working fully as a filmmaker, do you have to keep like practicing those muscles? Like, what do you say if you're trying, what would you say to people that are trying to elevate their documentary filmmaking game if they've been in it for a few years?
Yeah, I think you still have to do that. Like today I shot this thing for German television. Is weird. Like right now I'm not doing a lot of work because we're in lockdown, right? But so this crew from Germany called me, and basically I was filming a story about my daughter for German TV about what New York kids are doing under the quarantine and the pandemic, right? Because they wanted it. And so I had to shoot the same thing. All they want is sequences. Like when my daughter logs in to do her online classes, I had to shoot her face. I had to shoot her fingers on the keyboard. I had to shoot the screen, right? And then I had to shoot the wide of the kitchen so that the audience would know that my daughter studies in the kitchen. So you constantly have to do that. It's like if you're a musician, the world, like Yo-Yo Ma still does scales, right? Like the best musicians in the world go 4 million times, then they play the thing that you know them for, right? And so that's the same thing with filmmakers. I think we don't have drills per se, but we have repetition, right? So if you want to be a really good premiere editor, just edit every day, right? It could be someone's like your kid's birthday party, or a stupid like I'm living in the pandemic 30-second video, right? It's that repetition. That's the point of drills, right? Scales, it's that repetition. So you still have to do it. And if I didn't do it, it was actually very painful because I haven't actually shot in like 3 months because of whatever, because of pandemic and all this other stuff. To shoot today was pretty painful because I had to discipline myself to go back to those fundamentals.
You know, I'm kind of just looking at almost like your third pillar, which is more the business side of documentary filmmaking a little bit. You know, it is interesting because at least when I was enrolled at Columbia, like they didn't discuss it as much. And you said even you, when you were getting into it, really had to almost teach yourself at some point. When we look at the business side of things, and when we do get a lot of questions, like I said, about people wondering how do you start getting financing for your films, or how do you get distribution, what are some of the places that you start telling people to look? Like if you're really just new to it, or you just are so confused and overwhelmed with that process, what are the kind of building blocks?
Well, good and bad. Like so being a documentary filmmaker, you kind of work reversed of how normal people work. And what I mean by that is like if you're a chef, right? You go, you cook some food, your boss pays you at the end of the week, right? So with a reporter, you can cook and you can report all you want, but no one's necessarily going to give you anything at the end, right? And so we actually have to invest in ourselves quite a bit before anything happens. So that there's no way around that. There's when you say you want to do a story on homelessness, you might have to go to Skid Row for 2 weeks and just hang down there and find sources and interview people and all that stuff, right? That no one's cutting you a check for, especially if you're starting out, right? So that's a personal investment. There's nothing around that. Now, once you get past that, where you found a good story, you found sources, you're ready to go, then it kind of works in our favor. And what I mean by that is that to make a film, you will often get funding. So you're paid to do the film. So when it's done, it actually doesn't matter if it airs or not, if that makes sense, right? Because you've already been paid to do things. It's super nice if it does, because you can make more money, you can pay back investors, you can do all that stuff. But the funding part is the first part, right? Where to make a living at this, even before we think about selling, so there's two ways, there's the making and then there's the selling. The funding part is very key. Now the funding part is way easier than the distribution part. And so, especially nowadays, right? And so, let me see, if you were talking about, you know, a mid-size film, maybe even 10 years ago, you're looking at a $500,000 budget. Right. So like so that should blow your minds. It blew my mind when I found that out, right? 500,000, where am I going to come up with that? Right. Yeah. And how on earth is, so why did it cost so much? So back then, you know, equipment cost more. Fewer people were camera people, right? And so they could charge what they want. You know, if you wanted to edit, you would have to hire an editor in a rental suite, and like an Avid suite could cost like $1,000 a day. So you can imagine those things add up really fast, right? Yeah, and so that's those kind of things. So talent is still expensive, but those hard costs of equipment are much cheaper now. So that's a bonus, right? Now, if you can shoot and edit, then you've eliminated two jobs that you don't have to pay for. You get the money, right? So that's the first thing you have to understand, is that it's much cheaper now, but talent is still expensive. Like you don't want to cut costs. Like if you're not a good editor, you still want to get a good editor, and you should pay them the right thing, right? So the thing with funding that I was very scared of is that when I started, I thought that my ideas were good. Like I really believed into my ideas to the point where I had to convince someone my idea was good. And I was like, well, why would they give me, a no name, some money, right? Why would anyone give me, I've never done anything. Why would they give me any money, right? Some of you guys are probably hitting this roadblock, right? It's like, it'd be nice if you just cut me a $20,000 check so I could do that thing, right? It'd be awesome. So there's some truth to that, because people want to make bets on established players, right? If you have a track record of doing good stuff, then people will those who get funded more, right?
Right.
But people are always constantly looking for good stories, right? And this is not kind of a rah kind of inspirational part. A good original story is hard to come by. And if you have unbelievable access to that story, if you have exclusive, not in the sense of like a celebrity exclusive, but meaning no one has found this person or this angle, that's invaluable, right? That's invaluable. So I talked to my friend Poe, who is a commissioning editor, Al Jazeera Witness, that documentary program. And she says, if we feel a story, meaning she'll cut like a $60,000 check to a young filmmaker to finish their film, right? And she says, if we believe in your story, we want it to succeed. Now, if we don't believe you're a good enough shooter, we'll pair you with a cinematographer, right? If we don't think you're a good enough editor, we'll mentor you through your editing, or we'll get you an editor. But the point being, we're only going to give you a shot if that story is good, right?
Wow.
So if you have a good story, it's not easy. Let me take that back. It's easier said than you would. It's easier done than you think, to find someone who believes in that story. Now, there's programs like Al Jazeera Witness who have a certain point of view, right? They cover, underserved communities. They cover issues like immigration and stuff like that. But also, there's organizations out there that want to hear from women. There's organizations out there, you can Google them, and they're like, you know what? We're kind of sick of every award given to a white man, right? In the documentary world, we're kind of sick of that. We're kind of sick of 95% of PBS documentaries directed by white men. We're kind of sick of X, Y, and Z, right? So if you have a good story and you fall in line with an organization's vision, that's a possible funding strategy. Now, another thing that I learned was that we often think that there's this pool of money that someone out there will give just to filmmakers, right? Like, I just want to give money to filmmakers so films get made. People want to give money to efforts. And so when my partner and I made that film Deep South a while back, one of our largest funders was not a filmmaking funding agency. It was a cosmetics company.
Wow.
MAC Cosmetics, MAC Cosmetics. They have the MAC Foundation. Basically, the founders had a really good friend who died of HIV or died of AIDS. And they created a foundation where a certain percent every year of their sales goes into the foundation, and they fund projects, right? And they fund, it doesn't have to be films. It could be like a nonprofit they'll give money to, right? Or someone is starting a clothing line that will benefit,
right.
AIDS movement. So the reason they gave us money was the topic of the film was about HIV and AIDS, right? So what I learned that, I had to have a good story. I had to find the people interested in that effort. Very few people are just inherently interested in films, right? There's no one just walking around like, I'm going to fund some films today. Like, that's what I thought that people did, but they don't actually, right? They'll fund me as an Asian male. Sometimes people are like, I dig it. Like, I'm sick of just the white male thing. Let me fund some people of color. So I'll ride that, right? Some of you guys, I see female faces galore here, right? Like people are sick of dudes, so they'll fund female. So that's an effort, right? As opposed to, I'm just going to fund films blanket. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing is I found people with like-mindedness. So I just finished a short film about the immigration crisis in Mexico, right? And so the funding for that came from the, oh my God, now I'm blanking out, reporting the, hold on one second, let me find it.
On the spot, on the spot. While he's Googling this, you guys, we have about like 10 to 12 minutes. If you have questions, start putting them in the chat. It'd be great if any question.
Okay, so I got funded by the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, right? Because basically what they fund is stories of inequity. So I'm like, hey, there's these people from Guatemala. They just traveled 2,000 miles to try to cross the border and they're getting screwed. So they're like, yeah, we'll fund that story. Does that make sense? Like if I came with them, it's like, hey, I want to do this story about this kid who wants to play basketball. Regardless if that's a good story or not, they would not because it's not in their wheelhouse, right? So the first thing is I have to have an airtight story, and then I have to find the like-minded folks, whether they believe in this thing, this entity, male, whatever our identity is, right? Or the topic of the film. So once I identify those, and like I said, we never thought we'd be funded by a cosmetics company.
No, that's wild.
Right? Yeah, and it was just because their friend died of AIDS, and they created a foundation that said, you know, we're gonna support work around this. So that's the thing about funding. It's easier than you think. I mean, it's still a process, but sometimes we think of the wrong avenues to go down, right? You have to think about who would want to see this film. And if they want to see this film enough, are they gonna help me get it seen, right? And help me get it made. And so that's one area of thinking. If you look at most corporations, McDonald's, all this, they have a philanthropy department, right? And sometimes it's icky. Sometimes you don't want to get in, you know, associated with a certain brand or something like that, right? Like I probably wouldn't like take money from like Exxon or something like that, right? Regardless of their philanthropy. But there's corporations out there that are just corporations, right? And all corporations at some level are icky. So you have to pick in your battles, right? But they also can do quite good if they have a fund that believes in your type of stories, right? And so that's really helpful.
So I mean, it seems like especially when searching for funding at some level, you just really have to know your audience almost, because that'll help you find potential partnerships when it comes to funding. That's what it kind of sounds.
100%. So like the first round of funders always in every filmmaker's career, and you get this once, friends and family. One time in your life, you get the friends and family fund, right? And so really want to make the film, right? And sometimes friends and family will be enough to get it off the ground at least, right? So that's the first tier on there. And so it's actually the hardest because you feel or if you're a good person, you feel quite responsible, right? The second tier are NGOs that are maybe not associated with filmmaking specifically, but are associated with topics, right? Whether if it's environmentalism, right? Or they're interested in like homeless issues, or they're interested in whatever. There's a whole SWAT for every issue that we're interested in as storytellers. There's a whole series of NGOs that are working around policy around that, right?
Right.
So that's the second thing. And then the third is obviously organizations that support you, the individual, whether you're a woman, person of color, a young filmmaker, first-time filmmaker, right? Which is not always the same thing, right? And so those organizations are out there as well. And the worst thing you can do is assuming that you don't qualify. Most of us disqualify ourselves first because we're like, well, why? I've done nothing. I have this shitty little YouTube thing I put up, or I don't even have that, right? But what we forget is what you have is your presence in the world and your particular place. Meaning, I am in Brooklyn, so you guys are in the Bay.
A lot of us are in like the East Bay area, but
yeah, okay,
trickle around.
Right. So you are there, right? And you have a knowledge of the there that no one else does, and so that goes a long way. And it took me forever to learn not to. I was almost like ashamed about not being somewhere else, right? Like you know, if you weren't in New York, you would try to come up with a New York story. And I grew up in Connecticut, so I would never pitch a Connecticut story. Meanwhile, I've never done a New York story, and I live in New York because you know, it's kind of saturated here. I've always had to travel elsewhere to do my stories, right? And so you have to remember that where you are, there's value, and we often disqualify ourselves too quickly on that in terms of the story.
Right, right.
Yeah.
We have a few more minutes. Nobody's typed a question yet, but you can also unmute yourself and ask a question. But you can literally, Duy is a great resource. So anything about the world of documentary, I'm sure he will at least attempt to answer in some way. So don't be shy if you have any curiosity. But in
Yeah, just shout it out, guys.
Yeah. I'll give it like 15 seconds and I'm gonna ask a question because I have bottomless questions for you.
Well, I have a question. So, hi, I'm Esther.
Hi, Esther.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this. It's super amazing and informative. So, kind of going back to like how we opened this conversation around sort of the 8-part Tiger King series and the narrative of that sort of world and how that's kind of like a car crash we can't turn away from.
Yep.
And then, you know, and then the idea of like a lot of like journalism or documentary films sometimes having to like put the lead in front so then the story doesn't flow as well, so you can't really necessarily gain like an 8-part series. Like, what do you see? Because we had a really interesting talk a couple weeks ago. No, I don't even know what day it is anymore. A couple days ago with an impact producer around documentary film. So how do you see, as we kind of have these shortened attention spans and having so much access to media and sometimes information, like how we can move from utilizing documentary film into action as well? Because there's such a power, right, in the film as a medium, but sometimes we then leave and don't know what to do with that information, which is the price of the climate change world, right? You know, and we're only hearing the stories we want to hear sometimes,
right?
Because siloed.
No, it's a great question. I think the first part is I kind of push back when people say our attention spans are shorter. We actually have to pay attention to way more shit than I did when I was little, right? Because you'd come home and there was the evening news and that was half an hour and then you went on your way and maybe you read a magazine, right? Or something like that, right? Like, or if you had them, or I don't know, whatever we did back then, right? So I think that there's more competition for our attention, but we are quite capable of watching an 8-part series. The thing about
in one sitting,
about Tiger King, right? Or when we've been binging in all this whole pandemic, is that one thing is that we the reason why the Tiger Kings and all them of the world continue to get the acclaim and the attention and the buzz is that what they do really well, which is tell a story, right? Tell a story that you want to watch to the end. Tell a classic knight, princess, dragon story, not a news story, right? So we are so invested in the news part of the news story. I'm a journalism professor, right? Like 32% of this type of thing, blah, 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 right? Like we love that and we're inspired by that and it's in our DNA to get that, right? So the only way someone is going to go beyond what they already know is getting new information, right? That's the only way, right? Like, I think I'm going to assume, and I can't see everyone's face, at some point, everyone in this room, or most people in this room is like, yeah, climate change is a thing, right? Like, I'm going to assume, right? Climate change, we all kind of agree. To what degree, maybe our scientific knowledge isn't that great, but like, just as human beings, we're like, yeah, funky shit is happening in the world. Like, yeah, something's happening, right? And we probably weren't really the best stewards of this planet that we could have been. So something's happening, right? The reason why we only freaked out for 30 seconds when that UN report came out is there was no narrative. Okay, so we have to do. It sounds dirty. It sounds really dirty, but to have a call to action, we have to be able to tell something that's compelling, right? We have to have a character trying to do something, and by the end we want to know if he gets the princess or not, right? And so like I said before, we always frame it on the knight got the princess or the world is burning. Okay, thank you for that nugget of information, but you haven't bought enough time to give me more detail, right? More nuance, right? And so narrative is how you do that, and it's actually the hardest part of what I teach at Columbia is that the idea is how do I turn this it's easy to write fiction, right? Like if you watch a movie like, I don't know, someone mentioned Lord of the Rings or something, or or even what was that one? Game of Thrones. You guys watch Game of Thrones? Did anyone watch that on HBO? Anyways, it was super popular. It was like 8 seasons, 1,000,000 hours long, right? And people, that's why I say, like, I don't believe people don't have attention
Right.
spans. People watch like 1,000,000 hours of that shit in a row, right?
And still rewatch it.
Yeah.
And still rewatch it, right? And so, and the reason is the writer or the producer of the show is so good at bringing us along to the end, right? There, in every part of that is the idea that there is this hero on a quest for something. And so I thought, you know, over the years, as I've taught journalists to become documentary filmmakers, that's an uncomfortable construct for us, right? It's like, what do you mean a hero wanting something? That's fiction. That's like in the creative writing department of Columbia, right? But it's like, no, it's a structure, right? It's a structure to bring us to the end. The narrative, the only thing that narrative is to get us to the end of 90 minutes or 9 hours. That's the only thing narrative is about. The inverted pyramid, where if any of you guys were reporters back in the day, the inverted pyramid is to give us the information as quickly as possible, right? Well, we all know that climate change is bad, or we all deny climate change. So we don't need speed at this point, right? We need that depth to give us more information. And so the narrative, the idea is like, how do I tell this story? The topic is climate change. Here's some facts. But what is going to get me to the end of 90 minutes? Who is my hero? And sometimes that's a literal person.
Mm-hmm.
It's a climate change worker, it's a student, it's a fisherman, right? Like that's out there, or it's someone living in the Gulf of Louisiana where their front yard no longer exists, right? Because of rising seawater. It's someone like that. And this person's trying to fish. Okay, suddenly I'm kind of interested, right? There's this person trying to fish because I can relate to it. Maybe I'm not a fisherman, but I can relate, like I'm an average Joe. I'm trying to make a living for my family. This is my home. We all kind of respond to those themes. And then as we watch a well-told story, it's like, is the guy going to survive the rising water? And in those 90 minutes where we're trying to figure out if the guy is going to survive the rising water, the filmmaker sneaks in 32% X, 40% this, policy this, right? Republican that. Like it's kind of like, you know, the zucchini muffins, right? When you put zucchini in muffins for kids, right? Like no one wants to rock zucchini, we want the muffin, right? And so we kind of have to think that way a little bit. And I used to feel dirty about that, but it's like, why? Like if I can tell a good story and if I can buy more minutes, and by buying more minutes, I get to squeeze in more facts, I'm all for it, right? And so that's one thing I think beyond the camera work, beyond the editing, training yourself how to be a narrative storyteller is amazing. And here's the thing, we all know how to do it. Like if you've ever been to like a dinner party, right? And you like, or you met up with friends for a drink, we naturally tell stories, right? Esther, you and me are friends, right? I meet up for a drink and you go, hey, how's your day, Duy? And if I say, fine, like that's a boring drinks, right? If I start off, you're never gonna believe what happened, right? Right? Like, and right? It's like, so I was trying to go to work today. The fact that I go, so I was trying to go to work today, already builds this tension in, right? So you guys have all had those conversations, right? Yeah. We're natural storytellers, but somewhere in the process of making media and learning how to edit and film and all this stuff, we forget that natural inclination of bringing the audience along for the ride. And that's where you go, well, yeah, you're trying to go work, and I'm pulling out, and this guy hits me and, you know, rams me on the side, and you're like, what happened? It's like, yeah, that's not the bad part. So I get out. Turns out the guy's a state trooper, right? Like you're building this tension along the way. We have to figure that out in how to tell our stories as well. And that's probably the hardest skill. If that answers your question. I know it was long-winded.
Yeah, no, it was awesome. Thank you.
Well, before we wrap up and let Duy get back to his life on the East Coast, we just had one last question, which I thought was a really interesting one to highlight, and kind of going off of the theme of climate narrative, saying that every time I see a movie that tried to make a point of highlighting the dangers of climate change, it nearly always gets criticized as being preachy. My theory is that people sometimes just don't want to face the reality, but how as a filmmaker can you combat that, you know, preachy reaction people get, or the eye roll that people get?
Happy. That was a good movie. Happy Feet. I don't know. I just got some money to do speaking of climate change film before Corona happened. So I'm grounded, but so I have to figure out the same thing. Right. And so a couple things about audience. you want to respect your audience, right? Like you don't want to assume they're dumb. You don't want to assume that they're silly. You don't want to appeal to like the most basic of human kind of thought, which is some of my problems with Tiger King, right? It was just a little too poverty porn for me sometimes, right? I was just like, yeah, you know, it's punching below the belt at some points, right? But so you want to respect that you have a quality viewer. That's one thing, right? The second thing is you can't always assume what that quality viewer will think of you, right? So they might think you're preachy, but the best thing is all you can do is check your intent, right? If your intent is to present some facts, here's some facts, and we do have an agenda, right? I think my agenda when I make this climate change film is like, this is the thing that's happening, and real people are getting affected. That's about as preachy as I will get, right? And but you can interpret that as very preachy. Don't tell me what to think, right? So you have to respect your viewer, but there is no guarantee that they'll respect you back the same way, and that's fine, and that's totally fine, because the thing about filmmaking, I think, if we go full circle to what I started with in the beginning, like any idiot can make one film. It's making two that's the trick, right? And so why does that? It's like, let them criticize your first one, then go make another one, right? And if some of their criticism's valid, then you get better with the second one, because we've all made mistakes, right? And then your second one, you'll have a whole batch of other criticisms, some valid, some not valid, and then you get better on your third one. So you can't really predict, you can't really, like, don't stifle yourself in terms of it, to anticipate criticism, react to it when it comes.
Well, this was amazing, Duy. I so appreciate the fact you took time to jump on virtually.
Oh, yeah, I'm pretty free these days.
That's what I like, continue trying to capitalize your time.
Exactly.
I feel like could have just kept going. I mean, there's just so many aspects, and you touched on topics I wish I could circle back and get more information on.
Anytime.
Maybe I will convince you to come again.
Yeah, great. I hope if you guys are all aspiring filmmakers, like I said, just go find a story, right? Gotta find a story. If you're learning the craft, repetition, just do the shit over again. As boring as it is, like literally shooting your boyfriend or girlfriend making a salad. That is, I made Allie do that in grad school. Like she paid a lot of money to learn that, right? And so if you just that repetition, building that muscle, it's invaluable, because you don't wake up one day and you're like, I'm a filmmaker, right? That's not a thing at all, right? That's not a thing at all. So you learn the skills, right? Which is the thing, you always work on your story, and then eventually, once you have a story, you can get a couple bucks. It is shocking the idiots who make money get grants just because they had belief that they could get those grants, right? And often those are the types of people that always get the grants, right? Like, I'm just looking at this board, I don't see everyone else. A lot of us aren't the type of faces that often get grants, but it doesn't mean they're out there. And hopefully you guys change that paradigm a little bit, right?
That's our goal.
So just go for it.